just to introduce you all, first, I'd like to thank everybody who's come on to see us tonight. There's people from America, Joni Scanlon, Kieran McMullen, people from all over the world are here. I'd also like to thank Liam O'Sullivan, Niamh, Ben and Nadine Hassett, who are helping to show that not even a worldwide pandemic is going to stop us remembering our history. And I think my 1916 relative would be quite happy about that. So thank you to all who've organised this from Trasna na Tíre. Derek Molyneux and Darren Kelly are two historians that I'd rate very highly. Actually, I'd rate them top of people that I know in terms of history. They've written two of the best books on the Easter Rising. Just if you don't know who I am, I run the Easter Rising Stories YouTube channel, and I've collaborated with Derek and Darren on documentaries on Michael Collins, as well as on films on Dan Breen and Sean Tracy. Now, I just want to see if I can just share a PowerPoint slide just so you can see it there. Okay. So this is the talk that we're going to be having here. Derek has collaborated with me on documentaries to do with Michael Collins, the 1916 Battle of Main Street, the Battle of North King Street, as well as films on Dan Breen and Sean Tracy, whose relation is here tonight as well. I see you there, Kathleen. Their research from Derek and Darren is second to none. And the advantage that they have over some academic historians is that they can take you to the buildings where the events actually happened, which I think is really important, and it helps bring history come to life. I've also ran a tour with Derek Molyneux on Mount Street for a few months, so we know that really, really well, one of the key battlefield sites in 1916. This talk is going to be interesting. This talk is, there's going to be blood, there's going to be guts, there's going to be history that's not going to be sugar-coated or adopted in a revisionist tone. I'm a 1916 relative, like I say, and I find this very refreshing, okay? So grab a drink, sit down, and buckle up for a wild ride for the next hour as we remember 1916 on Easter Monday 2020 and show that no matter what has been thrown at us in our lives, that we're still going to remember that brave generation of 1916. So, Derek Molyneux, you're very, very welcome to this event. And
thanks, Marcus. Thanks all.
I'd like to ask you, if that's okay, what inspired you to co-write your book When the Clock Struck in 1916 with Darren Kelly?
Good question. Because inspired, yeah, is a good word, good choice. Yeah, because I mean, it was an inspiration. The simple answer is that we just wanted to tell the story the way that we saw it, with the intensity that such a riveting story deserves. It kind of struck us that a lot of what we came across just hadn't been. It was still unrevealed. A lot of the human dimension, a lot of the ferocity of the fighting that took place, a lot of the tactical astuteness of the Irish volunteers. The story is years ago, as a lifelong military historian, and I know I can speak for Darren in this regard as well. We've studied battles from, First World War, Second World War. I mean, Darren will take you back to the, pre-Roman times if you want. It's just something that's fascinated the pair of us. And but when we started to really delve into what actually went on in Dublin, particularly with the advent of the online witness statements, it was just something that we felt we had to do. It wasn't something that was planned. It was literally a case of, I suppose, we got the Facebook page off the ground in 2011, courtesy, thanks to my eldest daughter Shannon, and we were approached by one publisher about writing, about doing it was a kind of a coffee table book. We didn't really get that off the ground, and then it was more or less a case of just going at this, reading more, and then until one Sunday morning, I rang Darren and said, "Listen, do you fancy writing the book about the Rising?" And Darren typically went, "Yeah, okay, let's do it." And it just started from there. But as I said, it's the military story is it's fascinating, and this was something that really inspired me, was to get this story out, to kind of dispel the myth, not purposely, but it just happened while we were doing it, of these, in inverted commas, poets, and philosophers who hadn't really got a clue what they were doing, going out for this, as it's often been, so often called this blood sacrifice. And we found out that this was absolutely, as far as it gets from the case of what happened.
Okay.
It's a wonderful David and Goliath story of an empire that had never been as vast, taken to task by its underdog next door neighbour. As they say, the spark that lit the flame, and ultimately changed the world because it shook the British Empire to its foundations.
Okay. Well, let's have a look at that then. Your big focus is especially on the ground, okay? Rather than the leaders, you're actually looking at the fighters, the people you actually shot, blow by blow. You actually feel like you're in the streets with them when you're reading the book. How well thought out, though, were the plans from the Irish Volunteers side? Were they well thought out?
If anybody who's read the book will take a look at the prologue at the book, and we took a section from Joseph O'Connor. He was the vice commandant of 3rd Battalion. We took about 3 or 4 pages verbatim from his witness statement, and he details how meticulously planned things were, just from his own battalion's perspective. These guys were switched on. As soon as you read that section of the witness statement, that's a point that comes across, and that applied across the board. And this revealed itself in the fighting of Easter week to the expense of the British Army.
Okay. Now, one thing that I would like to ask you is that a lot of people, it's not to take away from the GPO, but a lot of people, when they think of 1916, all they know is the GPO. But other battles are incredible around 1916 as well. One thing that we especially looked at was the Battle of Mount Street. And we've called that the bloodiest battle of 1916. Yeah. Why is it the bloodiest battle of 1916?
There's 3 things, and they all begin with T, but I'll come back to them now in a second, because you mentioned the GPO. When I was a young lad in school, learning history, which I loved, we were just given this impression of, as I said earlier on, these naive Egypts basically going into the GPO, and it was painted to us as if like the British had brought a battlefield up the River Liffey and bombed them out of it, and then they all came out waving the white flags. But to move on to topography, tactics, and tenacity. The topography, you had Northumberland Road and Mount Street Bridge. The length of Northumberland Road, you had on the stretch of road that saw the worst of the fight, with 250 yards. There was no left turns. They were just completely hemmed in, under fire from elevated defilade position in Clanwilliam House. Plus, they were also under fire from the sides as well. Plus, you also had the bridge itself, which the British were actually drawn towards. The way the defences were laid out was a defence in depth, where each layer would retreat as it became overwhelmed, and that would subsequently strengthen each of the layers behind it until the Sherwood forces actually got to Mount Street Bridge, where they came under fire from the front, but also enfilade fire from the side, from the likes of the railway line and from Boland's Mills and other around there, including Yard. So that was the topography. Well, typically, for the time, just the First World War, you had the British running into a wall of fire time and time again, which they played right into the hands of the volunteers who were looking down on them and shooting at them. Again, as I mentioned, the volunteer tactics were ultimately to draw them onto the bridge. But then there's another tactic as well, which is very important, which was targeting officers. If you look at the casualty statistics, there was 32 or 34, were killed. 18 of them, as far as I remember now. It's a few years since I delved right into this, but there was a huge proportion of officers. Now, you look at the amount of officers in a British platoon at the time. There was
just before you go on, just to give people an idea of this. This is roughly about 13 Irish volunteers versus 1,600 British soldiers. Right?
Yeah, not exactly.
Okay, go for it.
You have in the epicenter of the battle, which was the length of Northumberland Road and the positions that directly overlooked it and ran alongside it, you had 13 volunteers. But you had, you hadn't got much more than 150 throughout the entire garrison area, which was the 3rd Battalion's area. But it's important to note as well that there's a lot more to this battle than those 13 volunteers, and the rest of the battalion have kind of come in for a lot of undue stick over this, that they apparently sat on their hands. They didn't. Boland's Mills was constantly engaged. As soon as the British began to outflank Northumberland Road down into places like Percy Place, they came under fire. Now, it wasn't very accurate fire, but from Boland's Mills and from the railway line, from Roberts Yard. But later on, when the British started to, you can see it there in the painting, the bridge was a bloodbath. It was described by, it was one of the brothers who was fighting in Clanwilliam House. There was bodies knee and waist high. The casualty figures, they kind of testify to the level of fire that was aimed at the bridge. So you're talking about a lot more than 13, but along the line of standing directly in the path of the 1600 were 13 volunteers. There's no way you can take away from that. And those 13, along with their supporting forces, held up both of those battalions for 9 hours. But more importantly, they held up an entire division behind them, because those two battalions, their job was to clear that ground to facilitate the advance of the division that was coming in behind them from Dunleary. And that they failed to do. They got held up for an entire day, which was huge in terms of the strategic significance that they had for such a small unit. It's probably unprecedented. It's kind of tragic. I remember saying this before in the video that we did down there, that it's very, very unjust that that area isn't kind of treated in a similar way to places like the Alamo.
I know, and I've been to the Alamo, and I think it's incredible. Actually, when I first interviewed you, I remember putting down the camera going, what, are you joking? Did this actually happen here? Why do I not know about this? This is insane.
Yeah.
Another battle, though, that was really interesting, that again is absolutely ferocious during 1916, is the North King Street, the Battle of North King Street. And I wanted to ask you about North King Street. Why was it so ferocious, and why was it so important tactically?
Tactically, it was pivotal because taking North King Street would seal the city from a strategic perspective as far as the British were concerned. By the time the fighting really kicked off in North King Street, they had done what they planned to do. They'd isolated all the other garrisons. They had driven a wedge between the forecourts and the GPO. North King Street and the Church Street area, had the volunteers held that. Part of their backup plan was to use that area as, to funnel themselves out of the city if they had to, where they could beat up with Commandant Ash's 5th Battalion and, form into columns in the countryside the way they very successfully did at Ashbourne. So sealing off North King Street would deny the enemy egress from the city.
But this was like 80 Irish volunteers versus 800 South Staffordshires.
Well, you have to look at it from the wider perspective of it was part of the overall forecourts area, which Commandant Daly, for a man so young, he did incredible work there in the way that the area was set up tactically. The reason why it was so vicious, you asked, was, well, there was a combination of things. Number one, the South Staffordshires. These were lads that had grown up pretty much on the rough parts of industrial Britain. They come in, they followed the Sherwood Foresters into the city, so they saw what happened to the Sherwood Foresters at Mount Street Bridge. They came across, they witnessed the aftermath of the bloodbath, so they didn't like the rebels. There's one of the things that we mentioned in the book was prior to the Battle of prior to North King Street, when the North Staffordshires were deployed around the Mount Street area, they got wind of a funeral. There was Patrick Whelan. He was the first volunteer to be killed during that battle, and he wasn't actually he was in Boland's Mills. They were trying to bury him. But the British soldiers from the North Staffordshires, they were trying to kill the burial party with ricochets because they couldn't get a direct line of sight to shoot them. And that's personal.
What do you mean? They're actually hitting to get a ricochet that actually hit the person?
Yeah, when you haven't got somebody in your rifle sights, when you're trying to kill them by, ricocheting bullets, you're putting a lot of effort into killing them. You're getting creative. That was the mindset that they had at that time. So they were the North Staffordshires. It was the South Staffordshires who came in more or less alongside these guys that were sent down to to North King Street. And it was kind of a combination of both of those things. Plus, the tenacity of the 1st Battalion. The 1st Battalion were very, very effective fighters. And as you mentioned there was 80 of them in the North King Street area. There was more spread around the forecourts area. Yeah. But 80 that were there, they held back 800 or thereabouts for 30 hours.
That's right. They only advanced about 150 yards, I think it was.
Yeah, about that. But it wasn't, I mean, the thing was as well, it was the tactics. We mentioned the tactics and we go back to the whole, the myth of them being very naive and not knowing what they were doing. But one of the things that we came across was that they actually corralled the British infantry from one side of the street to the other with their fire to get them to make their way into the laneways. That's a real tight-packed warren of laneways.
Yeah, and it's like a crossroads as well, where the tap bar is, which is the main point. I'll put that back up on the screen actually so people can see. The tap bar you can see here on the bottom right of the picture, and you would have had a number of people here, but this is at a crossroads. Yeah. So it was the South Staffordshires were trying to advance. And this pub is still standing, by the way. It's closed at the moment, the tap house, but it's still there. It's one of the few things that are still there.
It was called Riley's Fort, but if you look at that particular building there, you've got the ground floor, you've got 3 floors above, you've also got 9 windows to the side, where if you're advancing towards that, those volunteers who are in those windows have a much better view of you than you have of them.
Yeah.
That was a very, very well. There was a lot of armed volunteers in that building. The crossroads itself was a lot smaller at the time, but again, there was fire directed from that building with such effect that it drove the South Staffordshires into the laneways that are still there today around the markets area, where there was other volunteer positions, and they cut them to pieces.
Yeah, I often felt that the massacre, the North King Street massacre, is what it's known for, but actually takes away from the battle, because the battle is absolutely incredible as a battle. Yeah. It's absolutely ferocious. But I'll move on because we could be here all night on this question. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the British. How did the British base their strategy like a chess game during Easter week?
This is something I found fascinating with this in terms of the British Army. Strategically, they were brilliant in what they did. Tactically, they were dreadful.
Yeah.
Strategically, on Easter Monday, when you look at what they were confronted with on Easter Monday, their priorities were 2 things: Dublin Castle and the Royal Hospital, Kilmainham. That's why you look at the worst of the fighting on Easter Monday. I know there was a horrendous. If you were a British, cavalryman, you would have considered it horrendous. Ambush there just in front of the forecourts. There was other stuff going on elsewhere, obviously. But City Hall and the South Dublin Union was where you saw the worst of the fighting on Easter Monday, because their objective was, first of all, secure those positions. That's where our top guy, Dublin Castle, it goes without saying, they under attack.
Yeah.
So there was forces sent there in strength, plus Royal Hospital. That's why there was such intense fighting around the South Dublin Union, because that's next door. But once they had, if you look at what they did, they went into the South Dublin Union. There was ferocious fighting for Easter Monday, and then the British withdrew from the Union on Tuesday. So it was no longer a threat. They were prepared to leave it. Then they kind of knew they knew what was going on. They knew the amount of enemy that were there. They had, well, not that they knew, they had a better idea. And plus on Tuesday morning, that's when the serious reinforcements arrived up from the Curragh. So their strategy was protect their primary assets first of all, assess the enemy, and then contain the enemy until their reinforcements came in, which they did on Wednesday. Use those reinforcements to properly isolate the enemy where you can. And once you've done this, to speak of the chess game, that's when they start, picture these generals looking up at a map, and you're looking at, Capel Street is a perfect example of this.
So for people who don't know, is this like a circle, I'm piercing a circle, or how would you describe it visually?
If look at a map of Dublin, you're talking about 5 garrison positions on the south of the River Liffey, 2 on the north.
Okay.
So I isolate the 5 on the south. The 2 on the north were last to be dealt with. Okay. And Capel Street, if you look at a map, where you've got the Liffey going horizontally across, Capel Street sits halfway pretty much between the forecourts and the GPO, and it's perpendicular to the river. So that's what they did. They crossed the river, they took Capel Street, and that separated the GPO from the forecourts. And then, as we mentioned earlier on, that was what gave them the opportunity to seal things off via North King Street. But just in terms of the chess game as well, it was how they moved their artillery around. I remember Darren was saying to me at the time, he was impressed by the way that they did this, because it struck him that they were moving them around like pieces on a chessboard.
Yeah, they were like 16-pounder guns.
18
pounder guns.
Again, going back to what I was taught in school, this image of a battleship coming up the River Liffey, and a lot of people today would just say, oh yeah, that was the Helga, that came up and bombed the GPO, which it didn't. The 9-pounder gun, which was used against Liberty Hall. But the 18-pounder, the first one was deployed in Tara Street, the second one on Delair Street, and the third and the fourth were up in the Rotunda area, up around that area, so that they could bombard the GPO area. But they knew that the GPO in that area was where enemy headquarters was, so that was why they sent their artillery against that. You can look at, even looking at the timing of when the artillery was used, we deal with it in the book. Was, we mentioned that Friday was ominously quiet. The volunteers in the GPO were saying, what's going on here was very suspiciously quiet. There was enough fire going on that the British gunners would let them know that they were there, but this real serious artillery bombardment started Friday afternoon. Okay. This was to facilitate the movement of the South Staffordshires, because they were proceeding on foot down side where the custom house is, up Gardiner Street, and going to engage North King Street by going around the back, up along by Dorset Street and up that neighborhood. Yeah. So they weren't going to bomb their own men.
Yeah. Did the Irish, though, did they win any battles decisively in 1916? Like, what about Ashburn?
Yeah, Ashburn was a decisive victory. Bear in mind, they were up against the RIC.
Yeah.
So, they did have training, but they weren't trained, proper military. But even with that, it's a very interesting question, because they weren't in a position as such to win any battles. Well, you could rephrase that question to say, did they lose any? You can nearly say the answer is no. And again, this was something that I found astonishing when we were, really, really delving into this story. They weren't actually beaten.
Even Paddy Holohan in North King Street was there going, they had the ceasefire line after the GPO had surrendered. They weren't ready to surrender.
Yeah, well, this, it struck me as quite similar to the Shermans in 1918. They were like, where are we surrendering? And you look at the way we deal with it in the book when we talk about the surrenders. You look at in Boland's, in Bakery and the Mills, you had volunteers smashing the rifles off the floor. One, in frustration; two, because they didn't want the enemy to get them. But even the GPO, the myth of they're completely overwhelmed. So they, Neil Jordan coming out waving white flags. No disrespect to Neil Jordan. He brought a lot of people into the whole history thing. But they didn't. They redeployed. And the only reason, and they had a plausible plan to link up with the Four Courts garrison. And the reason why that didn't come into effect was because of the escalating civilian casualties. But when they surrendered, everywhere was holding out. South Dublin Union was holding out. Jacobs was holding out. College of Surgeons was holding out. Boland's Bakery and Mills were still holding. Yes, there were serious setbacks. They lost the Mendicity Institute, but which was ultimately just an outpost position. They lost Mount Street Bridge, which again was more of an outpost position, but they weren't actually beaten. There was some skirmishes where mentioned the Mendicity Institute, where the British soldiers, well, albeit Dublin Fusiliers, were driven back. Same thing in the South Dublin Union, Marrowbone Lane. You had near trench warfare going over there with the levels of attacks that were launched against that. In the South Dublin Union itself, where the nurses' home is, you had the Sherwood Foresters getting sent in and beaten back. So they could constitute small victories. That was one of the things that struck me, was that they technically weren't beaten.
Well, one thing, though, that you mentioned, and I have a picture of him here, Richard Mulcahy in the Battle of Ashburn, is because the War of Independence utilised flying columns. And could you argue that maybe Richard Mulcahy used the idea of flying columns in the Battle of Ashburn in 1916?
Well, it wasn't just Mulcahy, it was the entire 5th Battalion was a flying column. They went from Swords to Donabate, across to Ashbourne, and that's what they were doing. They were a unit that was on the move.
Yeah,
and they engaged the enemy wherever they were. There was fighting in Swords, as I said. There was skirmish there up in Donabate, and then working the way across to Ashbourne, where there was a more ferocious battle. So they were the flying column. It wasn't so much. I mean, Mulcahy came into prominence during the Battle of Ashbourne itself, when at a particularly critical point he displayed the leadership that was to become so pivotal later on.
Yeah. Because he's an integral part in the War of Independence anyway. In terms,
well, he was the chief of staff.
The plans outside Dublin City. Okay, so we're inside of Dublin. We'll return to Dublin as well in a few minutes. But what were the plans outside Dublin City? It couldn't have just been like, look, let's take over some buildings in Dublin, wait for the British to come, and oh no, we'll surrender now. Was it more thought out? What was the plans outside Dublin City?
Myself and Darren have written a book. It's unpublished at the minute, called Galway Was Always Ready.
Yeah.
And it's just, again, when you look into the depth of planning that went into what was going on down in Galway, that's scuppered by the countermand order, plans that they had, if the weapons and ammunition had been landed as planned, that they were going to be getting sent up along the River Shannon, they were going to be getting sent here and there by train. You look at the plans that were in effect, seal off roadways into Kerry so that the arms could be landed and distributed. You know, that's just Galway. I mean, you can look at they had squadrons of boats ready to get volunteers across Lough Corrib. But they go up to Belfast, where they had small squadrons of boats to bring volunteers across Lough Neagh.
Yeah. I find it incredible. I mean, I did a documentary on Sean McDermott, and you look at the outside plans from around the country.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand why Sean McDermott was so angry. The amount of organisation that went in, and to keep it secret as well, was incredible. I've co-written a book on the Louth volunteers in 1916. There was 97 of them that were going to be marching down from Dundalk to Dublin was the plan. According to some of the witness statements, the plan was when they get tired within Dublin around the Four Courts, North King Street area, they'd be retreating out and you'd have a fresh band of volunteers coming in. But because the countermanding order happened and you're outside of Dublin, if you don't go home, although a lot of them, including my relations, stayed out, but if you go home, you're not alerting the enemy to the fact that, oh yeah, these plans are actually happening for a rising. We don't want to give the game away. There's a lot of confusion outside the country, I thought, or outside Dublin. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it was the countermand order, the fact that they couldn't land the arms. I mean, it's in terms of drama, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, doesn't explode enough.
But there was serious plans there, which and the thing is as well, who knows? The what ifs are quite staggering. When you look at, even in Dublin itself, when you look at the numbers, you're talking about 1,500 volunteers or thereabouts engaged by the end of the week. But you look at the amount of British troops that were available in the Dublin area on Easter Monday, there was only 4,000.
Yes.
Now, I'm sure we've got some military or ex-military listening on here. I've discussed this with military before. They generally say that if you're attacking a defended position in open grounds, you need 3 men for every one that the enemy has. But I remember speaking to, he was a former sergeant in the Marines, and in the US Marines, he was talking about, but if you're going into a built-up area, you need 9. He's talking about places like Fallujah. Yeah. So you look at those numbers in Dublin, where you have an army that's 1,500 strong, which is not, it's not huge, but they have selected the ground. They have chosen the ground, they've fortified it, they've trained for it, and you have 4,000 troops in the area who haven't.
Yeah.
The whole notion of a blood sacrifice kind of it falls slightly by the wayside. Now, the counter argument to that would be, but of course, the British landed, 16,000 troops by the end of the week, so the British had more like 20,000 against 1,500. That's true. That's absolutely true. However, on Easter Monday, while they were being mobilised in and around the Watford area, you had a coordinated attack by the German, they had Zeppelin raids. You also had a series of attacks along the east coast of England that were launched in conjunction with the Rising to draw off any reinforcements that might be sent to Ireland. Yeah. You also had the possibility, that just might not have made it. This for umpteen reasons. They had to cross the Irish Sea, where there was U-boat patrols. So it wasn't a completely lost cause. What wasn't unlikely, absolutely, but they were still in with a throw of the dice, even with the countermand order. Again, the what ifs. The British got the artillery up from Athlone. Had they not been able to do that, things could have been different. The volunteers successfully derailed a train in County Laois.
Yeah.
So there was, it could have been very, very different had things been different. But just to kind of go back to your original point, the original planning was incredibly well detailed, and planning that they had to kind of make at the last minute wasn't necessarily stupid and naive. They did have options, albeit they were very tenuous options, but they were still options.
Okay. I'd like to ask you about the women. What about the women? Like, what kind of role did they play during 1916? Were they, like, what was it? Food? Was it nursing? Were they shooters? What was it?
It's well. The women were there was couriers, there was first aid, the support duties. But what I also found particularly, and again, this was one of the more unprecedented aspects of it. That was, you look at the Russians in World War II, what they did with the female soldiers. Look at Josie O'Keefe, who was in Marrowbone Lane, and there was herself and Robert Holland. It's amazing when you get into this level of detail of the story of the fighting that's going on itself, which is what we persevered to do. They're in a second or a third floor window, or a series of windows on a very, very strong building with a very high wall around it, and they're engaging the British infantry who are trying to get into the back of the South Dublin Union. And what they're doing is something that wouldn't really have been the done thing at the time, but they call it now as in fire and manoeuvre. Where Robert Holland, who was a sharpshooter, he'd have a Lee Enfield where he'd be able to put, he'd have 10 rounds that he could use in a magazine. So he'd fire that as quickly and as accurately as he could, whereupon he would hand that to Josie O'Keefe. She would reload that for him. In the meantime, she'd hand him maybe a Mauser rifle, which he would shoot. And when he handed that back to her, she might hand him a pistol. But at the same time as well, as they're moving from window to window. So if you're a British officer looking on, you're trying to assess the amount of enemy that you're dealing with here, you're going to think that there's more than two, and you're certainly not going to think that you're dealing with a woman.
Yeah.
Then, of course, you had Margaret Skinner, who was fighting in Stephen's Green, who personally led an assault to set fire to take out the British Lewis gun position. If anybody is familiar with Stephen's Green, the University Church, a lovely small little red brick church on Stephen's Green, halfway down along the length of the green, but her plan, they were under machine gun fire. There was a Lewis gunner in the church, so she led 2 or 3 men out to set fire to a series of buildings. One of them was wounded, including herself, as far as I remember. But she also had another plan in mind, to cycle past the Shelbourne Hotel and throw a couple of grenades in. That's right.
And she also famously said, more than once I saw one man fall, about her sniping.
Yeah, you also had Countess Markievicz as well, armed with a Peter the Painter pistol, which had a pretty good range, where she was getting stuck in as well. There was plenty of women. You had famously Winifred Carney running into the GPO with a typewriter in one hand and a revolver in the other.
Absolutely.
So, and again, it is one of those things that the women have been, it's just one of those that they've been written out of history. Well, okay. Kathleen Lynn, we forgot to mention her.
Go on, Kathleen Lynn, go first.
Well, Kathleen Lynn, when both commanders of the city hall, Citizen Army Garrison, were killed, she took over there.
Okay.
So yes, and you had Markievicz second in command in Stephen's Green, and Kathleen Lynn in command in City Hall.
Yes. Okay, I wanted to ask you about the South Dublin Union next. The South Dublin Union famously has got Eamon Cant, Cathal Brugha, and a number of others in it. What makes them so? It makes it so courageous.
South Dublin Union, amazing story to it. As I mentioned earlier on, it was a priority target for the British on Easter Monday. There was ferocious fighting, close quarter stuff going on in there on Easter Monday itself. And again, it was very, very disorientating for the British soldiers involved who were trying to get in. And then when they got in, they found themselves in a very, very tightly packed warren of buildings. But then the fighting ended up, this fighting going on inside the hospital, where you had, gun battles going on down the length of hospital corridors. You had hand grenades getting thrown in within hospitals. You had, this is really, really scary stuff. But it got to the point where you'd had silences in between battles, where you would have had small British units dealing with small volunteer units, but they don't know where each other are, so they're taking off their boots so that they can't be heard creeping around this hospital.
Okay.
Bear in mind, the hospital's full of patients, so they're witnessing this is going on. You can imagine they would have been terrified. But there was ferocious fighting there. Courage, you're talking. Well, yeah.
Just 1 second there, Derek. Liam, I'm trying to share a PowerPoint slide there, but I keep getting John Molyneux's screen. I'm not sure what's going on there.
That's true, Marcus, and I can't see a John Molyneux joined in the meeting at the moment. So
every time I hit share screen, it says you cannot start screen while the other participant is sharing.
Yeah, and I can't see a John Molyneux on the meeting at the moment.
It says you're viewing John Molyneux's screen. Let's see. All right. Okay. Well, we'll persevere anyway. It's still looking okay, is it?
It is. We have that Zoom screen up, and we can't see your screen, but I'm working on it.
Okay. You work on it.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Derek, sorry. Go on. I stopped you midway through. You're telling me about.
Yeah, you had them in a very important position adjacent to the South Dublin Union, which was the Marylebone Lane Distillery, which kind of covered the back of South Dublin Union and provided support throughout the week. Just in terms of South Dublin Union itself, the fighting that took place there on the Thursday when the Sherwood Foresters tried to storm in to take over the rebel headquarters, which was in the nurses' home, which is still there, I think. I know that they're doing the children's hospital there now, so I'm not sure what the story is with the old nurses' home. But, I mean, this was ferocious. This was really, really intense. We have a chapter that deals with it, but it was just really, really serious. Up close, personal, close quarter combat going on within buildings, within and around buildings, to the point where you had one British soldier playing dead so that he could get out of there. But in terms of courage, you also had chivalry. There was a ceasefire there. The volunteers ceased fire to allow a British burial party to bury their numerous dead. You also had a tribute effectively being paid after their surrender by the British officer in charge, Major Rotherham, who paid the volunteers when he came along and saw, I think it was 44 volunteers on the Sunday when they were surrendering. He asked Eamon Cant, he said, yeah, but when are the rest of your men coming out? And Cant turned around and said, well, what are you talking about? This is them. And he was very, very impressed. You held a fine position here. Cant turned around and says, yeah, well, we held you locked back for a week. And Major Rotherham actually gave them the courtesy of inspecting their ranks. And this was something that struck me because it flies against the whole the thought process of, you're not an enemy. We don't recognize you as an army. You're just a bunch of idiots with, pistols and pikes. We don't recognize you as belligerents, which was predominantly the case. However, in the South Dublin Union, Major Rotherham, in getting the surrendered volunteers to line up with their arms, still shouldering their arms, that he inspected them on parade, was a very, very serious tribute to make to a surrendered enemy. And he also he refused to identify any of them afterwards in Richmond Barracks. Courage also, particularly in the South Dublin Union, from the nurses and the doctors. It was Nurse Keogh who was shot there in the stomach on Easter Monday itself, but you also had the nurses and the doctors who stuck around for the week, making sure that the patients and those under their charge, and there was 3,000 civilians in the South Dublin Union while this was going on.
Well, Bruno got shot like a number of times. He used to joke that you could hear him rattling with the amount of bullets he actually had.
26. He was wounded 26 times between bullets and shrapnel. And at one point when it looked like the nurses' home, it just couldn't hold anymore. Cant ordered his men to I think it was the bakehouse and the boardroom, which overlooked James Street. It was an adjacent building that they had to kind of go through a sort of a warren of buildings to get between one and the other. Cahill stayed where he was. And we do paint a picture in the book of what confronted the British soldiers when they eventually came across him behind a barricade, covered in blood. I mean, his hands would have been so wet with blood that he would have struggled to even reload his pistol. But yeah, he was singing "God Save Ireland." But more importantly, when you imagine this chaos of this building, with, you've got ceiling plaster, you have windows breaking, you have walls coming down, you have explosions going on, grenades going off left, right, and centre, you have pistol fire, you have rifle fire. Just this atmosphere of absolute chaos. But Brewer had the presence of mind that while this was going on, to call men, to address men as if he was looking at them. You two men over there cover that position, you two men cover that other position. So again, the British soldiers who are in a state of panic because of what they're dealing with here are under the impression then that they're dealing with more than just one man, who's albeit a very, very badly wounded man. An incredible presence of mind to display at a time like that. Sort of thing where if you look at the British Army or the US Army, the Victoria Cross is the highest award that you can get in the British Army, and the Medal of Honor is the highest that you can get in the US military. Now, there's two criteria. Obviously, you have to show incredible bravery, but more importantly, you have to show that your bravery swung the pendulum effectively, that it made a huge, it made a significant difference to the battle itself. And Brewis did, because the position was lost.
Okay.
Until carrying on that he wouldn't surrender, that he was singing, that his fellow volunteers heard him, and they came rushing back to his aid, and the British retreated.
Now, one thing that I found that me and Derek would often talk, and sometimes you become that immersed in the history, sometimes you talk about the more light-hearted moments of 1916, and there are plenty of light-hearted moments. So I just wanted to ask you about one or two of them. What stand out for you?
I can't do one or two, Marcus. When did I ever do?
Give it your best shot.
I mean, Dublin, Ireland, you're not going to have a scrap like that without some funny bits. It's just, it's who we are. It's how we roll.
Yeah.
You mentioned blind sniper to people. Just kind of, what? How can you have a blind sniper? This is a young fella he was only 16, I think. And he was in the Fenia, but he was in the College of Surgeons, but he was pleading with his comrades, can I have a shot at your rifle? And they gave him a go. But they strapped up the rifle in such a way that it couldn't be aimed anywhere else other than the Shelbourne Hotel, which you can actually see there. And he fired off, I think, about 10 shots while he was saying Hail Mary and Our Father while he was in between shots. Then he had the ducks getting fed. I mean, I don't know of any other engagement where you had, and they weren't organised ceasefires. I think it was just spontaneous ceasefires where both protagonists were just looking at it and going, hang on, are we really, I know we haven't slept in a couple of days, but are we hallucinating here? Young lads
down the guns, the ducks need to be fed,
You had the two young fellas up in Marrowbone Lane. One fella who was, he stopped off there to have a look in to see what was going on.
Yeah.
Volunteers asked him, what are you doing here? And he said he was bringing the chickens on his bicycle to the lieutenant. So they took the chickens off and says, give me best regards to the Lord Lieutenant. Then he had another young lad who the same day was bringing three cows. I mean, just in the middle of this city, where this battle is going on. Marrowbone Lane with 3 cows. But because there'd been a battle hours before this had happened, there's debris lying around, so he's a young fella, so he's picking up whatever he can see. He's completely distracted, but he doesn't notice the volunteers coming out of Marrowbone Lane and taking his cows, which they subsequently slaughtered. But I think it's Thomas Young was on a vantage point where the young fella saw him and says to him, have you seen me 3 heifers? Trying to keep a straight face going, no heifers came down this way, but they were well fed. But then you also had, as I mentioned earlier on, the British soldier who, I think his comrade had been killed. They sent a wagon into the South Dublin Union to take away the dead, and he was cut off. The only way that he could get out was to play dead. He was put into a coffin and taken out on this horse and cart up to nearby Rialto. And I can only imagine what the local civilians would have thought when they saw, these 5 or 6 coffins on the back of this horse and cart. Suddenly the lid pops off one. This soldier jumps up and runs off. And bear in mind, this is Easter. So go on. People probably blessed themselves as well. The GPO, some of the stuff going on there, it's just, you'd be wide-eyed at the shenanigans. When you had the Swede and the Finn, which is funny in itself, Liam
Why were they there, for those who don't know?
Well, Liam Tannum his witness statement is fascinating when it comes to the stuff that was going on around the GPO. He answered the door to them, and they happened to be there because they were sailors. and they just stopped off, and next thing there's this insurrection going on against Britain. And at the time, Russia occupied their countries. And it was an ally of Britain, so they kind of thought, well, okay, so you're fighting against Britain. Effectively, then you're fighting against Russia, so therefore we should join you. So Liam Tanham let them in, handed a shotgun, which went off accidentally, and shot a volunteer in the foot. So that volunteer spent the rest of the week in a hospital bed at the back of the GPO, for the last day or so in the company of James Connolly. But after that, then you had, even during the evacuation of the GPO, you have this insane scenario. Liquid flames coming down the walls. We describe it very well in the book, what was going on. This was, you're talking Greek tragedy sort of stuff. Yeah. This having to rush out the side of a building under machine gun fire, under shelling, the artillery fire with shrapnel shells. As Fergus de Burke, who says, I could see bullets like hailstones hopping off the street. So Liam Tanham was standing across at the corner of Moore Lane. He's trying to help coordinate the evacuation into Henry Place. And under this deluge of fire, he's looking at volunteers carrying out trays of eggs. Well, again, it just lends more weight to the argument that they weren't out of options. They were making plans. They were planning on out, but they still had loads of food. So, but just trays of eggs with machine gun bullets.
But food is very important for you during a rising. You need to have when you're fighting. The two things that stand out for me in terms of being lighthearted was and this is something I read in witness statements, was the wax works. There was a waxwork of it was King George, and I think it was Wolf Tone, and they both were in a window and they're getting shot to bits. And some of the volunteers thought that was hilarious, seeing them both getting shot to bits. And then there's another one in Jacob's Biscuit Factory. Somebody found a gramophone and they started playing God Save the King as a record, wind up Thomas McDonough,
of course, it's dubs. It's how we roll. Even when it comes to the wax museum, they also have a wax dummy of the Kaiser. And one of the volunteers went down and he took his Pickelhaube helmet and he. So again, Liam Tanham was looking at this fella stomping across the street, following the guy with the trays of eggs with a German infantry hat, or the Kaiser's helmet on. What the hell? And then of course another fella went down and took a massive big crucifix. So he's like Jesus on Good Friday carrying the cross, across Henry Street under fire. It's full of hilarious anecdotes, and even afterwards, even when you get up to the stuff that was going on afterwards, it's laced with comedy. But at the same time as well, that's the human side of it. Any sort of an engagement like that, it's going to bring it. When something is as intense as that, it's going to bring out the funny side of people.
Now, we got 4 more questions, and then we're going to throw it open to if anybody wants to ask a question. Maybe if you could send it in, and I'll read them out at the end, the questions. But I wanted to ask you, Derek, talk about the human side. Let's get into the blood and guts and gore of the thing. What is so controversial about Easter week?
Oh, controversial? Well, number one would be the North King Street massacre. 16 civilians that were shot dead. Well, not even shot dead. Some of them were bayoneted to death and buried under floorboards. The photo you have there, Mount Street. I don't know if controversial would be the right word to use, because it was what it was, but it's something that's kind of been overlooked. You're looking at that sort of still there, which is from insurrection. It's obviously not in time. But you look at the density of casualties. It was 4 or 5 years ago. On the Matt Cooper show, I was asked to paint a picture of what went on in Northumberland Road, because Hugh Lenehan, he couldn't grasp just the fact that it's such a nice, quaint sort of a leafy suburb. He couldn't marry both images. So I asked him to picture the opening scenes in Saving Private Ryan, and everybody has seen that. It's horrific. It's grotesque, for a very good reason. But Northumberland Road probably looked worse because you had a much higher density of casualties in Northumberland Road than you had on Omaha Beach. Plus, you're also looking at the antiquated weapons that the rebels were using, alongside the Lee Enfields that they also had.
From British point of view, this is like World War One. This was like charge, wave after wave, and they're getting annihilated.
Yeah, we worked out that there was 13 set-piece attacks made around in that particular battle. These were full-on infantry charges. Okay. The casualties, the official casualty statistics are 234 killed and wounded. We think
a huge number.
probably a lot more that weren't as seriously wounded, but this was 1916. If you were over on the Western Front and if you were an officer and you sent a company of 200 men at the German trenches and half of them were wiped out, that wasn't a bad day at the office. You didn't stop because you lost 5, 10, 15% of your men. So if the British made 13 set-piece attacks during that battle, they had serious casualties in the 12. And
you were talking about the British tripping over the blood and guts of people who were killed, involuntarily relieving themselves, screaming for their parents, mean, total carnage, this.
That's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with fairly untrained troops, probably 18, 19 years old. Conscription had only come in January 1916. A lot of these guys probably would have been conscripts. A lot of them would have grown up as farm boys, and necessarily ruffians. And they were just kind of fed into this, very, very badly trained and certainly untrained for, urban warfare. And then, of course, the volunteers, they were using these Mauser bullets. You hold a Mauser bullet in your hand, you compare it to the likes of the Lee Enfield bullet. I mean, a Mauser bullet will, if it hits you in the shoulder, it'll probably pull your arm off. If it hits your head, there won't be an awful lot left of your head. They were huge, massive bullets. It's fair to say that, you look at the official casualties numbers, I think it's 34 dead or 32 dead and 234 or thereabouts wounded. But the reason why there weren't many more killed was because there was 3 hospitals in the immediate vicinity. So nurses and doctors came out, they were on site to come out and deal with these casualties on the ground. They weren't in muddy trenches. They weren't cut off in no man's land for 3 days before they could get medical attention. Medical attention was readily available, and that saved scores of lives in that particular battle. It wouldn't necessarily be controversial as such yes, it would be in terms of the British thinking that they were using dum-dum bullets, which wasn't necessarily the case. Controversial to me would have been more along the lines of North King Street, where a massacre of civilians is another thing altogether. At Mount Street, it was described from both sides that chivalry was displayed, that when ceasefires were called, which they were honoured. But no such thing. North King Street was the gloves had come off. And, you had the 16 people being killed.
Now, it's good that you mentioned with the bullets. And by the way, we're getting lots of questions, which I'll ask at the end. So keep sending your questions, folks. I want to ask you about your second book, though, Derek. Your second book, Those of Us Who Must Die, which I have launched, by the way, and it's a fantastic book. You'd co-written with Darren, and it looks in depth at the executions of the 1916 leaders. Why did you do this? Why not just go straight into the War of Independence?
Well, it deals with the executions. It also deals with the deportations. It deals with that they come back and then right up to what we see as a sort of a linchpin moment between the Rising and the War of Independence, which was Thomas Ashe's funeral, which was a big marshalling point. Somebody needed to do it. That's the simple answer. There's a lot of great books out there that do touch on the executions, but they don't really, deal with them the way that we did, where we literally pick up where we stop in the first book, where the volunteers are marshalled in the grounds of the Rotunda Hospital. They've been given an awful time. They're going through the city, the reactions from the civilians, then of course, the executions. But we needed to do it because it hadn't been done, and it certainly hadn't been done in such an unflinching way. And what struck me as well doing this, and kind of inspired Darren and myself to while we were doing it, was the heroism that really, really rings true afterwards.
Yeah.
While the fighting is going on, it's awful, it's terrible, there's people getting killed, but it's also it's exhilaration, there's elation. You've driven the enemy back, and then of course there's trauma, there's all these things. But after a defeat, when you haven't slept for 3 or 4 days, you've had nothing to eat, you're getting this horrendous reaction from civilians and soldiers. I mean, you know how we deal with some of the scenarios in the in Richmond Barracks itself. People, volunteers being water.
We'll cover that in a second, but that'll be the next question. But I want to ask you though, in your book though, even if you look at the deaths of Patrick Pearse, these are not they're gallant in the sense of, I suppose, public relations, but you detail in graphic detail these bullets ripping their bodies apart. The velocity of the bullet entering into their body.
It's something that we do throughout the thing. When you read the vast majority of military history books, you'll get descriptions. With notable exceptions, you will get descriptions of engagements, where 20 troops ran across the junction, 4 of them were shot, 3 wounded. But we wanted to convey what this means.
Yeah.
What's actually going on here. Again, in those of us who must die, this was something that we were quite concerned about doing, because when we spoke to Mick O'Brien, he's a former sergeant in the Defence Forces.
Yeah.
He basically described, he was talking us through a lot of the emotions that would, they're obviously, everything is going to change, from one century to the next militarily, but the emotions don't. The reactions among soldiers don't. The human side kind of stays the same. But what he was talking about was his experience with a Lee Enfield and what one Lee Enfield round would do to you. It'll give you a serious, like a hell of a kick, an undescribable sort of a kick. But you look at 11 bullets. I know there was 12 men in each firing squad. One would have had a dummy round, a conscience round, but 11 of those converging and hitting you in the chest. There's a reason why, and again, as far as I'm concerned, we're the first people, Darren and me, to cover it. There's a reason why they were shot on top of a canvas sheet, because they had to be lifted off the ground. And if they were lifted, from 2 men on one end and 2 men on the other end of the body, there's a chance that if they lifted it, there wouldn't have been a spine to hold both ends together.
Yeah.
This was something that we didn't do it because we wanted to be Quentin Tarantino. It's because a side effect of doing it the way we did, it just draws in the human element.
It's warts and all. It's what happened though.
Throughout the entire story, in the fight in itself, when you're talking about the revulsion that confronts, we one of the things that we mentioned when we're talking about Riley's fort there, the tap bar, the abuse that's been shouted by volunteers, the hatred that they're articulating towards the enemy, because that's the only way they can deal with that. There's close range stuff where they're shooting people with bullets that are doing serious damage to them. And you're brought up, thou shalt not kill. And again, I know we're going to probably be talking about the forthcoming War of Independence, but this is something that struck a lot of the IRA men when they were having to go and shoot people up close. But just to go back to the point of Patrick Pearson, the executions, we graphically detail what happens to a human body in a firing squad, because we felt that it had to be done.
Yeah, it did. I thought it was really so sometimes you can have this mystical kind of clanid version of, the execution, and it's not like that at all. It's an awful lot more grim. You were trying to explain to me, if you're blindfolded, I remember you pulling me along to show me what it'd be like being brought out to be executed, So
well, this was Darren, who as tenacious as he is and as meticulous as a researcher, this was something that he came across.
Yeah.
Again, the myth. Like the way you painted it there, you see somebody who's, been executed, they're being led out, and it's nearly musical. They're walking out slowly. It's nearly a last cigarette, any last requests before we put the blindfold on, while you stand stoically. That wasn't the case at all. They were blindfolded before they were brought out of the building, and you're jostled and you're hustled. You're not walked. You're completely disorientated, but it's not done to be cruel. It's actually done so as not to be cruel. Once the blindfold goes on, the idea is to take away your cognitive awareness.
Yeah.
So that's for your own sake, but it's also for the sake of the firing squad themselves, that they're not going to have to make eye contact with somebody who, as far as they know now, I know this didn't happen in Kilmainham jail, but they would have been used to dealing with, the executions where they would have had fellas who were crying for their mothers.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if they blindfold somebody and completely take away their cognitive awareness, that's less likely to happen.
Let's look at the actual people who were taken away, like the actual people who were brought off to the cattle ships.
Yeah.
Why did you look at the treatment of the Irish volunteers immediately after surrendering in such detail in your book as well?
Because it's something that's the narrative has overall narrative has kind of looked over. And again, it's something that struck us. People look back on history and they remember the heroism that was displayed in combat. But what about the heroism when you've been beaten? When there's 50 or 60 of you stuck into a cell with a bucket for a toilet, that's also used the same bucket in particular cases as your drinking water.
Yeah.
To be taken from that to mixed reactions from some of the troops were so hostile that it brought out the kinder nature in a lot of the other troops who couldn't abide what their, the harsh treatment that their comrades were meting out. Then to be marched through the city, to be put on this cattle boat and told you're being brought out to be drowned in the Irish Sea. You're sitting in slop, basically. It's a cattle boat. You're probably talking an inch, 2-3 inches of shit and piss, basically, effectively. And you're so exhausted, you're put into this, and there's fellas vomiting on each other because they're getting seasick because they've no air getting in. They're getting dogs abuse on the way in. But even while this is going on, and you see it as some of the volunteers are marching through the city, where they're singing, just stop themselves from down. You're looking at this and you're kind of going, this is the real heroism here. You mentioned it before when you were launching the book, the bridge on the River Kwai. Yeah, the most moving pieces of cinema that, as hard done by as these British POWs are by the Japanese, they're shown that they're unbowed. They may be beaten, but they're unbowed, which is exactly what the 4th Battalion did when they were being marched past the South Dublin Union. They started singing God Save Ireland. Yeah. They also did it, other volunteers did it while they were being marched to the cattle boats. They sang, and their demeanour, it's well documented that the executions, swayed public opinion, but we allude to it in the second book. You can actually see the changes in people as the volunteers are being marched along the quays to the cattle boats. There's people crying as the week progresses because they're starting to look at these and they're thinking, hang on a second here, there's something impressive about these people. Yeah.
They're already making plans for the next move, like nearly before they even left Ireland to get to prison. Yeah. Let's look at your last question, okay, that I'm going to ask before I throw it open. I'll ask any questions that are below in the chat after this. But you have a new book coming out this year. It's very exciting. We talked a lot about it. Can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book, Killing at its Most Extreme?
Killing at its very extreme.
Oh, it's very extreme, sorry.
We have 2 new books coming out. The first one is Killing at its Very Extreme, which has been published by Mercier Press. It's out on the 11th of August. We're launching it then, all being well, on the 3rd of September. And the next book is called Someone Has to Die for This. Both of the books, that's the second book's working title at the minute. But Killing at its Very Extreme, it picks up where Those of Us Who Must Die left off. That left the reader off at Thomas Ashe's funeral. Mm-hmm. This book picks up the following month, when you had the Sinn Féin Convention and the Volunteer Convention. It brings us through the reformation of the volunteers, the GHQ. It introduces Dick McKee in a way that he's never been introduced before. And
a lot of people don't know who he is. Okay.
He was the commandant of the Dublin Brigade between March 1918 and the time he was killed in November 1920. He was pivotal. Nothing happened in Dublin without McKee. But that's all in the book. But it's when we wrote When the Clock Struck, we didn't decide on writing a whole series of books. We just couldn't stop. This is a saga that goes all the way through. There are another thread of characters going all the way through. Frank Thornton being a prime example. Liam Tobin, who's very strong in the second book. He's phenomenal. He's pivotal. He was Michael Collins. He was the head of Michael Collins' deputy. You had Frank Thornton, and there's some great pieces about Frank Thornton in the first and the second books, and he's pivotal going forward, and including in the fourth book when it comes to planning of Bloody Sunday. But it's the same sort of thing. It's an unflinching style. We deal with the War of Independence in Dublin, drawing in some of the more influential things that were going on around the country for context, but it's up close, it's personal, it's in your face, and we break a hell of a lot of new ground with this book the same way as we did with our previous 2 books.
Okay. Well, that's it from my questions. So we'll just turn this over to the audience. I'll just read out some of the questions that they've asked you. Derek, this is from Conor O'Doulahan. Are there any surviving accounts of the North and South Staffordshire's activities in and around Mount Street or North King Street from the British perspective? Like any witness?
Darren would be a better man to answer that, because Darren did most of the research into the South Staffordshires, but there wouldn't be an awful lot. That would be my answer. A lot of the stuff was suppressed. I know that the units, it was the 26th, the battalion that was involved in North King Street, who committed the massacre, they were quickly moved offside.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tricia O'Byrne, it's more a comment rather than a question. My grandfather was in the GPO and was escaping out through the Waxworks Museum and thought he'd run into a British soldier, only to realise it was a wax figure. Okay. Joni,
hope he didn't waste his ammo.
That's a great story, Tricia. Thank you. Joni Scanlon, can you discuss the charge of the O'Rahilly and the plan behind it?
Yes, with great pleasure. And if Punchies is listening tonight, hello Punchies, I hope he is. O'Rahilly's charge, again, part of the overall the drama of what was going on. Okay, so you have the GPO under this intense artillery bombardment. They needed to get out of there. The place is on fire. They wanted to redeploy to, what was the name of the factory again, just down off Williams and Woods
factory. Yeah, Williams and Woods factory. Yeah.
They wanted to take the Williams and Woods factory, which was a similarly very, very big building. It would have been very easy to fortify, and it also would have provided a kind of a launch pad to link up with the Forecourts battalion. This was the plan, but needless to say, you don't send an entire garrison out without reconnaissance. O'Rahilly was the reconnaissance. So he would take a unit along Moore Street to go down the length of Moore Street and see if they could make it through. If they could make it through to Williams and Woods. If they could have made it through, they would have left, you'd leave a trail effectively. You would make sure you had an open line of communication between Williams and Woods and the GPO. Probably it wouldn't be any more than half a mile between the two positions. Okay. So they went with between 30 and 40 men. That would have enabled them to do that. So he marshalled them outside. He sent 2 columns down along Moore Street, one on either side, one on the western side, one on the eastern side of Moore Street, hugging the doorways, using whatever cover they could until they came under ferocious machine gun and rifle fire from the barricade that the British had erected down at the Parnell, what's today the Parnell Street end of Moore Street, what was then the Great Britain Street. There's great photographs of that British barricade.
Yeah.
They came under withering fire, absolutely withering fire, to the point that from the 30 or 40 who went down, there was only, when Sean McLaughlin came out afterwards, he was following them down to try and alert them, because from his previous vantage point, he knew the British strength in the area, so he rushed out with a GPO to try and warn them of what they were heading towards. But by the time he got to them, there was only 10 of them still standing.
One thing I found really interesting about that was Patrick Pearce says we're going to surrender because he saw civilians that were being massacred. And one thing that I didn't know, because I'm from Dundalk, I'm not as familiar with Dublin until I was there with you, was how close North King Street was. And you had the North King Street civilian massacre only like a couple of hundred feet up the road as well.
Yeah.
This was happening quite a bit, it seems, towards the end.
Pierce, and again, one of the things that myself and Darren, one of our cornerstones is impartiality. I wouldn't describe Moore Street as a massacre. There were civilians killed, but you had this intense battle going on. So you're going to have trigger-happy English troops, British troops, Irish troops in British uniforms that are going to be exhausted, that are going to be suspicious, they're going to be paranoid. They'd see civilians, but the enemy they're fighting is also predominantly in civilian dress. What swayed Pearce at the end of it, now they wouldn't have known about the North King Street massacre at this point either. What he did see was the Dillon family being massacred, machine gunned by British soldiers at the barricade, and we paint a grim picture of that in the book. There was also 3 elderly men that were seen being shot on Moore Street, but then of course there was the volunteers who opened fire on to try and open up a doorway in a panic when they're under this ferocious bombardment. They were looking for cover in the back of a house, in the backyard. They couldn't open the gate, so they tried to kick it. That didn't work. They knew it was locked, so a volunteer raised his rifle to shoot the lock off. Just as the father, the man of the house, opened the gate, and he was shot, and the bullet went through his shoulder but into the chest of his 15-year-old daughter. She was killed. So this had been reported to Pearce. So you had these 3 incidents that he saw firsthand, but then you would have had to have been a robot not to realise what was going on around you in terms of civilian casualties. Plus, again, alluding back to the point that they weren't out of options when they left the GPO, contrary to popular belief. Sean McLaughlin, who at that point who had been made the commandant and was very, very tactically switched on, he had been asked by the volunteer leadership about the feasibility of moving the 300 or so that were left in that garrison down along through Henry Street, Mary Street, all the back roads that were around there in order to link up with the Four Courts garrison. McLaughlin went and looked into this and he said, yeah, we could do it. We'll probably lose half our men and in doing so, and a few women that were still with them. But he mentioned, Pearse asked him, will there be a lot of civilian casualties? And McLaughlin said to him, he said, yes, there will, but you can't ask me about that. You want me to give you an objective, tactical answer. I can't talk about civilians. That brings emotion into it, and I can't do that. If you want to know, can we objectively do this? Yes, we can. So again, this was foremost on Pearse's mind about the civilians.
Stephen Doyle has asked, did Michael Collins have a significant role during the 1916 Rising, or did that only come later? I could chip in here just because I've done 4 documentaries on Michael Collins. He was an aide-de-camp to Joseph Plunkett during the 1916 Rising. He certainly came into prominence immediately after 1916. One thing that I found fascinating was Kathleen Clark in the Irish National Volunteers Fund appointing him to go around the country, in terms of the funds. And he helped develop his contacts that way, with the IRB contacts. Do you have anything to say about that, Michael Collins' role, or not?
Well, if it's Stephen Doyle, hello Stephen, hello me. Yeah, Collins, I mean, he was a staff officer in the Easter Rising. That was his position. He was aide-de-camp to Joseph Plunkett. But bear in mind, Joseph Plunkett was he was the man who, foremost among them, laid out the strategy, the tactics for defending the city. I mean, his input was pivotal.
Yeah.
So Plunkett was, he was many things. One of the things, again, he was a keen student of military theory and history, and so a lot of the designs of the Dublin defence were his. Aide-de-camp to him, yeah, and Plunkett was a huge influence on Collins, particularly in terms of the book, The Man Thursday, which became pivotal in framing Collins's mind about how to conduct the warfare that later came along, that he was pivotal to. Collins was, he was in the GPO, so, he was there, he was under fire like everybody else, but in the redeployment to Moore Street, Collins led a charge into what became known as the White House, and directed fire from the White House back along Moore Lane when they were, and anybody who's familiar with the area would know that they had to cross Moore Lane to get into Moore Street, but crossing Moore Lane meant, running the gauntlet of a British machine gun in the Rotunda Hospital. So Collins was ordered by Sean McLaughlin to take a squad of men in to the White House, which was under such ferocious fire. There was so much fire hitting this building that in the pack of the redeployment, they thought that the fire was actually coming from the building. It would have been that many ricochets.
I couldn't believe they did that. Yeah,
just in the heat, in the fog of war, that's the sort of thing that happens. But Collins was ordered to men in there, and those men don't engage the machine gunners in the Rotunda.
That's very true. It's very true. I think we'll end it there, but I just wanted to say just one or two things just before we do finish. First of all, Derek, thanks a million. That was a fantastic,
thank you, Marcus.
Fantastic conversation. You can see even from the comments, it got a lot of positive reviews.
Excellent.
I just wanted to thank Trazin and Natira for what has happened. I think what they're doing is incredible.
I'll second that.
Something I want to say, though, is you can hear from this conversation just what an amazing battle 1916 was. Now, I've traveled all over the world. I've had World War I relatives. I've visited World War I battlefield sites. I've gone to America. You visit like the Alamo. And honest to God, we have got such an amazing history. And we don't shout it from the rooftops. It's nearly like we're embarrassed by it. And we shouldn't be. It's an incredible history, and we should shout it from the rooftops. And that's what Trazin and Tira are helping us do this year. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Trazin and Tira, as well. Great job, folks. Absolute great pleasure to be here. I'm delighted. I'm honoured to have the opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Liam. Okay, I'm going to sign out now. Okay, so thanks everybody. All the best.
Thanks. Okay, all the best, folks. Stay safe out there.